Everybody, it's Susan Lindner. I am the host of the Innovation Storytellers Show, and we are back with another phenomenal guest who I believe will absolutely blow your mind when it comes to thinking about how we work, where we work, the way we work, and what is the future of work. John Winsor is the absolute expert in this topic and has been working in this topic for, what is it, John, more than a decade?
A couple of decades.
Couple decades. Yeah. So please take a listen as you're thinking about how you structure your team, where your team is in the world, where they're working, and where is your next best talent coming from too. It may not be within the four walls of your office. So let me give you a little bit of background on my friend John Winsor. He is a thought leader and a global authority on open talent and the future of work. His ideas, expressed through his writing, speaking, and the companies he's built, have placed him at the intersection of innovation, disruption, and storytelling, my personal favorite topic. He is a leading entrepreneur and advisor in the open talent space and has launched several companies, which we'll get into. John is also the executive in residence at Harvard Business School's Laboratory for Innovation Science, and he is the founder and chairman of Open Assembly, a company that provides the world's first digital aggregation platform to help organizations reduce the friction in the adoption of open talent and freelancing. He is currently writing his 6th book, in case you already read the other 5. It's called Open Talent, Leveraging a Global Workforce to Solve Your Biggest Challenges, along with his co-authors, Kareem Lakhani and Jin Paik, the founders of Lish. So Harvard Business Press is going to publish the book in the beginning of 2024. Is that right?
Exactly. Yep. That's it.
And you can take a look for it there, as well as perhaps a lovely excerpt in the Harvard Business Review. You might be able to find something there. Is that right?
That's it. Coming up.
Okay. So John recently also co-founded a global industry coalition of leaders in the open talent and innovation industry called the Center for the Transformation of Work, with the goal of revolutionizing the workplace for 1 billion people by 2025. I love having underachievers on the podcast. It's really important to me to kind of level the playing field. John, thank you. We're just going to tap 1 billion people by 2025. Thank you for setting the bar so high for the rest of us. So welcome to the show, John. So first off, tell us how you got here. How did you get into the space of open talent and innovation? Where did it all begin for you?
That's a great question. Thanks for having me. I think it just came out of a personal need to understand where the edges are. And after college, I moved to Boulder, Colorado, and where I live now. And I hooked up with this merry band of dirtbag rock climbers, and that kind of took me around the world to do a lot of stuff. And I found it not only super exhilarating to climb big mountains and really hard, more technical routes, but it was also a way to kind of calm my monkey mind. The idea of being 20 feet above your last piece of protection and being really focused on exactly what you needed to be focused on. And that just really excited me. And I thought my business life, because by then I had started a couple magazines, and I liked those moments of terror, that balance between terror and absolute bliss. So I think I'm just wired that way, probably because of my ADHD and a lot of other factors. But that's how it kind of started, just out of my personal thing. And I think I've not been very good and always criticized for not fitting in and not doing, kind of towing the company line. So the first kind of, I'd say, big risky move I did in my career. I mean, I'd started a magazine in Colorado called Rocky Mountain Sports, but my wife at the time, Bridget, and a bunch of her friends were professional triathletes, and they were women in the sports market. And they were really curious by the fact that all the magazines, Runner's World and Bicycling and all the magazines, even though each of those sports is 50% men and women, the covers and the editorial was all for men because all the editors were male. And so they really questioned, like, why isn't there a magazine for us? And certainly there were magazines at the time called Self and Shape and things like that. And so across my desk came this proposal that Women's Sports and Fitness, the Billie Jean King, had started in 1974 with the Women's Sports Foundation. It was for sale, and it was in the midst of a bankruptcy. And so I thought, oh, what I'll do is maybe fly to Portland and talk to my buddies at Nike, mid-level people that had a storied career, Tinker Hatfield and Mark Parker, who became the CEO, and Tinker was the design director at Nike. And back then they were mid-level people. And so I sat around the table with them saying, hey, do you think women will ever do sports? And they said, yeah, women are going to do sports. And my point to them was, I had this opportunity to buy this magazine, but I have to put everything on the line. I have to mortgage my house. Like, everything is going into this. Should I do it? And Mark Parker looked at me and said, yeah, that's a great idea. Put it all on red. Women are going to do sports. We'll even run an ad in your magazine. And so I was, I think, naive enough to think that it might be a good idea. And it was one hell of a journey for the next 15 years. And I ended up selling the magazine to Condé Nast. And I think the editors that I hired helped spark the revolution. It was a really amazing experience. But I think along the way, what I learned there was not only, maybe the first step was like having the willingness to fail, like go big. But then the other things that were really important in the innovation process was that I couldn't afford the 40 editors and that were in New York, because it was just me in my garage with this little magazine called Rocky Mountain Sports. And so I decided to flip the whole paradigm. And I said, well, there are all these amazing women that do these amazing things. And right now, the way the magazine works is that an editor from New York flies out to Boulder and talks to the amazing climber, Lynn Hill, and then goes back to New York and kind of gets some of the facts right and some of the nuances right, but not all of them. And that the magazine wasn't authentic. And so why not flip the paradigm to say, let's have a couple editors. They're both athletes, but they're good editors. And let's let Lynn write her own story and then be able to let the editors edit that. So instead of editor or writer as Lynn the subject, let Lynn write the story and then edit it for the audience. And that saved a ton of money because we could get rid of 38 people that weren't really, they were more focused on being a professional editor than really focused on the subject. And then the other thing I did too was I just decided to, because the magazine at the time had boosted its circulation, because that was the way that magazines grew back then. I just peeled it way back and gave a bunch of the non-performing subscribers away to other people and got back down to the core. And I think that those two principles are really important, like create, for me, in innovation, like how do you create structures that force you to make big decisions, right? Like I'm not going to do it the typical way. I can't afford that. I'm going to have 2 editors instead of 40 editors. And then how do you make your product or your service smaller? Like, I think that's super important. Like, how small can you get? Because to me, that's super important when you're trying to launch something, right? Like, how super specific can you get that really services 100% of the needs of a small market and grow from there, instead of trying to do everything for everybody and it doesn't work out for anybody. And that's what was really, those were 2 really great learnings early in my career. And I think that set me up for this really amazing journey in marketing, communications, and strategy around innovation, on how do we innovate products, and then certainly products at bigger companies like Levi's and Nike and HP and Intel and things like that.
So we're having, it's such a regular conversation that we have on this podcast is about, I mean, you're talking about lean before there was lean, right? You're talking about necessity breeds constraints, which breeds innovation, right? Which is one of the cornerstones of what we understand shifting and changing to be when we really get down to its essence. And we just think about core design thinking principles around about getting to the essence about what people really want and need, whether it's on the employee side, right? And freeing up great talent to write really right at the edge of the sport stories. It's content that resonates because it doesn't have a middleman.
Yeah. It was interesting. One of the greatest articles that we did was one of our editors. It was right in the 80s, like the idea of women's magazines promoting breast implants and all that kind of crazy stuff. One of our editors had a breast reduction, and because she was a runner, and so it was like a hindrance. And so she read this beautiful article about going against the grain and having a breast reduction right in the middle of the hype of this kind of glorification of female manipulated figures. And it was unbelievable. And that article resonated so deeply with our audience, but it was totally against the common thinking at the time, right? And at the time, our editors were like, oh, I don't know if we should publish this. And when we did, it was just magic, right? It really was a galvanizing force for our readers. So I love your thinking on that.
Well, how many inbound inquiries or letters to the editor did you get that said it's ridiculous to alter the natural body and this
Oh,
is
yeah.
God's plan or things like that?
Oh, for sure. And there was always that. But I think that to me, I've always loved those things, right? I love the fact of, I mean, I feel like that's the job of an innovator, is to tell a story that is provocative enough that starts a conversation, right? It's
For
just,
sure.
I mean, one of the things that happened a couple companies later was that when I was at Crispin Porter Bogusky, we had the assignment, we had the Volkswagen advertising. And so one of the things that Volkswagen came to us with was the idea that, hey, we're really frustrated in 2008. This is 2008. All cars are pretty much the same safety wise, yet Volvo is always rated as the most safe car. And we're not even in the top 10 list. How do we do something that gets us in the top 10 list? And so what we wanted to do is spark a conversation around what is a safe car. So I don't know if you remember, but we did these crazy car commercials. One of the things we discovered in our research and strategy practice or process was that nobody had ever filmed an actual car crash with people in it. And so we thought that's super odd. You see all those crazy like mechanical things where there's the Volvo and a big piece of metal hits it, and then they have a test dummy in there and they're like, it's all safe and all that stuff. And so what we did is we got a Jetta, we put a ton of GoPros in the Jetta, and we had two actors, and we said to the actors, hey, something's going to happen that's going to cause you to have a car wreck. But we're going to have you drive down the street and it's all going to be filmed. And we want you to have a dialogue, just like you would like after work or going to the store with your friend or whatever. And will happen. So these 30-second commercials were two women having a conversation, and a truck pull out at the last minute and the car plow into it, and them being safe because airbags went off and all that stuff. And it was unbelievable. Like, it wasn't about the commercial. It was that every media source, every late night show, we're talking about like, how dare VW do an ad like that, endangering these actors. And oh, by the way, look, it's safe. They survived. And we only ran those ads for 2 weeks, but it's created such a cultural conversation about what is a safe car that Volkswagen in 2 months went from not in the top 10 to number 2 in safest cars.
Wow.
And I think it's all about storytelling, right? It's about how do you take that risk in your story to prove your point, that your story becomes much bigger than just benefits and features of your product. It's like, how do you move culture? That's what I think is super important about storytelling.
And what do you attribute the visuals to that storytelling mostly, or do you think it's the content that you put around it, the text that you put around it?
I don't think it's either. I think it's the mindset that we had. Because
Mm.
we had this mindset. And I think one of the things we really promoted was at the time, and I think this is still the mindset at the time, most marketing, and I think product design falls into the same space, and most innovation is that what companies do, they look around and they think culture is this Mississippi River moving through our environment, right? It's like this unstoppable 500,000 CFS thing that's carving out the landscape, or maybe even better, the Grand Canyon, right? Just carving out, and that's how culture gets created. And one of the things and so an agency or a design studio like IDEO, usually the perspective is like, we're going to do all this research and figure out where this is going for your product or your market. And then what we're going to do is we'll get ahead of it and we'll game it. But that just never seems to work because culture kind of takes these weird little turns. Our point of view was like, we know how to change culture. And we believe that great brands actually change culture themselves, and then the culture changes to their advantage. And so instead of us trying to figure out where culture is going and move around it, we actually spark a conversation that changes culture in and of itself. And so certainly with Volkswagen, we did that. We did that with Burger King. We did that with Microsoft, and I'm a PC. Probably the biggest example of what we did, which I love the most, is the work we did on Domino's. At the time Domino's came to us, they said, we are doing horribly. Our pizza sucks. And what we miss is this. Do you remember when it was like 30 minutes guaranteed? Like Domino's did this thing in the 70s and 80s where it was like 30 minutes guaranteed pizza.
Oh,
And
yes.
they're
I took advantage of
right.
that when I was in college. Absolutely.
Exactly. Right. And so what transpired was that their stock was doing well and they were doing well as a company. And then one delivery driver had a wreck and hurt somebody. And so they were legally, they couldn't say 30-minute guaranteed. And so one of the things we did at Crispin when we heard that is we said, well, it's flipping the paradigm. Instead of saying 30 minutes guaranteed, what we should do is create the digital tool that connects into the POS system, the point of sale system, that actually shows where your pizza is. Susan's Pizza just got the order. Susan Pizza got the ingredients. Susan's Pizza's in the oven. Susan's Pizza's in the delivery car. And instead of saying guaranteed 30 minutes, we flipped it to say, you've got 30 minutes. And you would have an app and it would ding going, it's the driver's GPS. It's 3 minutes away. Get ready for the table. So it was the same mechanism, but the responsibility was on the customer to be ready in 30 minutes versus guaranteeing in 30 minutes. And it just totally reaccelerated the whole thing because Domino's all of a sudden became a technology company. Their stock went up more than any tech company in the next 10 years. And they were able to recontextualize this. But it wasn't the story. It was the mindset of let's take what works and flip the mindset upside down and still use that mechanism of 30 minutes, but use it and give the responsibility not to the company, but to people to be ready for their pizza. And it was a super simple tool, but it really accelerated everything.
It's so fascinating because I remember the CEO, what was his name? Kevin? I'm trying to remember because one of the first talks I ever gave was on looking at innovation from different perspectives. And I used those perspective. It wasn't the 30-minute example though, which was phenomenal, which was their social media campaign instead. This is probably 2000. You were much earlier, but this is probably 2016, where their ad campaigns were "Our pizza sucks."
Yeah. That was actually in 2008.
Oh, it was that early.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
So,
yeah. And that was actually before we did the pizza tracker. That's how we started. So and what Pat Dolan was the CMO at the time, and what we convinced him to say, he kept saying, our pizza sucks. We're trying really hard. Our pizza sucks. And so our point of view on the strategy side of things was, well, let's just admit our pizza sucks. I mean, that's like it's like by saying that you're anything better than your pizza sucks is not only disingenuous, but it's a lie to your customers. So it's not true. Your customers know it's not true. Let's get some alignment here. And so we convinced, and I can't remember who the reporter was, to do this amazing piece on CNN where she kind of played it all out. She was like, oh, Domino's has got this new campaign called the Pizza Apology. And so Pat Dolan got on and he apologized for how shitty the pizza was.
Pat Dolan, right, yes.
Right. And so she took the pizza and threw it in the gutter. It's like, this pizza sucks. And it just made this huge PR-able thing, like who apologized for how bad their products are. But what happened is that it aligned the company and the brand with the customers with honesty, and it allowed some breathing room for the brand or for Domino's to improve the pizza and say, hey, we're trying really hard. And it was kind of very much out of the Avis, we try harder deal, right? It's like, we're going to try really hard, give us input. We're going to do all these things that make your experience better.
Well, I want to take that conversation because I think, it's one I've been having about 4 times today already. So I know it's really in the zeitgeist, but you were really ahead of its time. I mean, like you're describing your pizza's on its way. And I think that was the greatest fascination with Uber, right? It was the ability to watch your little black car on the map and watch it come to you. And then you could do it with pizza. And then you could order your pizza with just putting in the pizza emoji. And then and so Domino's really was becoming this incredible technology company. And I remember part of my own talk of the day is that there were more software developers being hired by Domino's than there were pizza chefs and marketers. And like, I found that so compelling. But the other side of this discussion is when you let the customer have a voice in your product and you're incredibly vulnerable and authentic about who you are and where you are, the world rises up to meet you. And I think that's part of what's happening even at an enterprise level in the workforce, and reading your works is that we confess HR can't do it all. Great headhunters can't do it all, but there is a wisdom of the crowd that says, I can help you if you
Yeah.
confess to me your vulnerability and where there's a hole in what compared to what I know.
Yeah. It's so crazy because I think you're totally right on. Because when I sold women's sports and fitness to Condé Nast, one of the things I was really fascinated with were diffusion curves, right? And I don't know if you know the story of diffusion curves, but yeah, it's such an amazing story. And so there was this really crazy guy at University of Iowa who's a sociologist, and his name was Everett Rogers in 1954, I think. And some agriculture people came to him and said, we're really struggling with trying to diffuse or make popular hybrid corn seeds. And we go to a small community and we give them to the very most innovative people, and then nobody else wants them. We're like, we can't figure that out. And so Everett Rogers figured out what the diffusion curve was. That he defined the innovators, the early adopters, early majority, late majority laggards. And essentially what he said was, if you give it to the innovators, it's not believable because like, oh, Susan does everything new. She's the innovator. I can't do that. I'm just like a regular farmer. But if you give it to that early adopter, that's the person who's got the political clout, might be on the city council, might be a part of the 4As. Like, oh, Joe, Joe's using those seeds. I think that might be a really good idea. And so where do you introduce a product into this, right? And so I found that super fascinating. And I launched a company called Radar Communications. And the idea of Radar was that one of the things that super frustrated me at Women's was that we knew brands like Nike had millions and millions of dollars to help advertise to women, and in the context of women's sports and fitness. But we would get like this tiny little bit at the end to advertise because we were the audience, right? And all these like intermediaries extracted all the money, like the advertising agencies, the research companies, all this stuff. And so what we did is we kind of came up with this idea called, I coined the phrase co-creation, a book called Beyond the Brand in 2003. And the idea was, could we mash up these two really what I thought were magical tools for storytelling? One was anthropology. I loved the way anthropologists could go and get native and really understand and live with people and understand it, right? But they're really bad communicators. They write in these horrible academic journals. And then one of the things I loved in women's sports and fitness is our amazing journalists. They could tell unbelievable stories. And so we came up with this idea called anthrojournalism. And so the idea was that we would essentially we were the first to use video ethnography and go out and find the stories. And so one of the things that really fascinated us.
Can I share with you that I'm an anthropologist?
You are? Oh, that's so great. I love it.
And so the process I had when I used to discover brands for startups back in the early 2000s, right after the dot-com boom went bust, it was clear that a different cycle was needed. And so I created this process called branthropology, which was—
You did?
Yeah.
I love it. That's so cool.
So using things like appreciative inquiry and really getting deep, understanding all the different tribes that surround you, your competitors, your customers, your stakeholders, your investors, and then really beginning to analyze those from an FRL for branthropologists somewhere.
Did you ever go to there used to be a crazy anthropology meeting, an ethnography meeting at Intel that they ran. Did you ever go to that?
No, I didn't even know.
Oh my God. Oh yeah. It was like 2003, 2004. And what was so crazy was that there was it had run for like 4 years, and Rachel Bell, I think her name was, or I might be mashing together two names. Anyway, they were really into this anthropology. We were doing a ton of work for them. They had this big conference with all the best academic anthropologists and all the best corporates, right? And there was this crazy guy. Right. And there was this crazy guy, his name Claude Rapai. Did you ever know that guy?
No.
Claude Rapai. Oh, so Claude had this magical way of doing kind of ethnography where he would bring people in and put them on the floor underneath a blanket and do this kind of dream state analysis. But he was super crazy. He walked on stage with a bunch of like Swedish supermodels, and he would only do kind of the old overhead projector and draw like bad mimeograph things and kind of yell and use obscenities. And I was there, and I was just such a young kid. Essentially what happened was Claude was becoming this really famous guy and got on stage and called bullshit on all the academic anthropologists. And literally The next person on stage was an academic anthropologist, really well known, somebody from one of the big schools. And essentially the guy stood on stage and said, F you, I'm like, that's bullshit. And it turned into almost a fist fight so bad that it split the corporate versus the academic side of things. And they never held the conference again. Like it was over. It was done. Because literally it was like the academic guy went on stage and yelled at the corporate guys. And then a corporate guy would come on stage and call names to the academics. And literally it was all day of like just raising tension, right? It was so crazy. Anyway, it was one of the most fascinating meetings I've ever been to. So
it sounds like it.
yeah, crazy. It was crazy. But one of the things that what blew me away in that work, and I think what's really important principle of innovation is you have to, in the context of anthropology, you have to go native. You have to know what's happening. And so we were running this big project for Levi's to launch their brand in Walmart. And we got together with a big C-level group and talking about what the strategy should be. And they were running through spreadsheets, and there were these great numbers and projections and strategies. And one of my teammates, this really, wonderful woman, Barbara Perry, who was an anthropologist, she just said, "Hey, wait a second." And she asked, "Raise your hand if you've ever been to a Walmart." Guess how many people on the executive team at Levi's who were launching a product at launching a product at Walmart had gone to a Walmart.
Oh my God, I'm having like a design thinking flashback, right? Like I'm going to say 0 out of 10.
0. You're right. 0. So it was so fun. What we did is right on the spot, we hired 2 vans from Avis or Hertz or whatever, and had them come to the Levi's office in San Francisco. And of course, there's not a Walmart in San Francisco, but there's one in Oakland. So we went across the bridge and gave everybody $25 to buy something at Walmart. And then came back in the afternoon, and people were just like, holy shit, oh my God, are these people really our customers? Like, it was just so mind-blowing that it changed the whole context of the conversation of like, wow, maybe we should start with a deep understanding of our customers, where they shop, what their pain points are. That's a really good place to start. But, getting people outside their office is still it's really hard, right? People tend to get so myopic about their competitors and the analysis and the profitability and the cost of the product that they forget, like, wow, I wonder how my customer would buy this, and if that's a big deal, and would they really accept it? I mean, it's better than it was for sure, but it's certainly a big challenge.
So as you think about this and moving, I love the conversation about anthropology always, but thinking about that disruptive, like this thread of how we're getting to this new stage of when we invite the customer in, right? When we invite the employee or the gig worker or the freelancer, when we invite them into our workplace, something else shifts, right? Our perspective, whether it's the executive going to Walmart and them actually touching a customer for the first time, or the other way around of bringing other talent in. I'm fascinated by that disruption. And what do you see is happening right now, John? What's going on with our disrupted workplace? And maybe give us a little history, because I think so many of us think that work from home started as a COVID phenomenon when that's not the case. So educate us maybe.
I mean, I've just been a code journeyer with a lot of other people, but back when I had the magazines, I just couldn't afford people. And it was this whole freelance phenomena for me. And why I set up these companies based on freelancers is that I just didn't have the financial capability to do that. And so it just started me down this path of like, oh man, there are millions of really smart people in the world that don't have the ability to work on great things. And what happens if you just opened up the world to allow that to happen, right? And I think you see that the foundations of this thing that I call open talent, but it's obviously freelancing. And we kind of divide open talent into 3 things. One is external talent clouds, which is freelancing; open innovation capabilities, which historically is called crowdsourcing; and then internal talent marketplace. How do you capture the cognitive surplus of inside your company, right? What I think is really interesting and really powerful.
But when we surplus, can you define that? So like,
well, there's,
I know, I mean, I'm sitting in my job at work in my little cubicle, but I know stuff.
Right. Yeah, why shouldn't you have the ability to say, I want to do what I want to do? I think the really great example right now is Unilever's using a platform called Gloat. And one of the things that Gloat insists and Unilever has done is to say, the company shouldn't be in charge of your career. You should be in charge of your career, but the company should give you options on what you want to explore. And so the ability to have a place to upskill in different areas, that's an open platform, the ability to throw yourself into other projects like, wow, I've been doing this work over here, but this work over here seems super cool. I'm going to jump in on that team and work a day a week on that to help out because I want to learn that new skill. The ability to kind of not have to leave the company to pursue your passions or pursue something that's interesting, to thinking about that. Because I believe the future is a portfolio of jobs. And one of the interesting things about internal talent marketplace is that it gives companies the ability to keep people, good people, there to create a portfolio of jobs in a career that's not linear. It's not like I moved up in finance and I did my thing. It could be, I did finance, but man, I was super interested in market research and that was really cool. And software design seems really awesome. I upskilled on some software design and AI is really interesting. And wow, how does AI influence finance? So that it becomes this really interesting journey for people. So if you look at the history of this idea of cognitive surplus, there are lots of examples of really early experiments on crowdsourcing. And probably the most famous one is the Longitude Prize. Was the Royal Navy was trying to figure out longitude and how you measure longitude. And they couldn't figure it out. And so a watchmaker actually came up with the idea because there was a prize, there was a grand prize. Nobody could figure it out. None of the technical people could figure it out. And this watchmaker figured it out. We see that historically as a way to solve difficult problems. And the way that our lab at Harvard started was with NASA. Essentially in 2007, Jeff Davis got the unfortunate news that his health and human services for NASA's budget was cut by 80%. And he still had the mandate that, like, I have to keep astronauts safe in space, but asterisk with 20% of the budget. And so he was really,
Here's some
he's
soup.
really
Here's some
exactly.
aspirin. Good luck.
Right, exactly. And so one of the first projects that Harvard did, Jeff came to see Kareem Kalakani, and Kareem said, what is an interesting project that you have that you're really concerned about astronauts' health? And it was around radiation from sunspots. Essentially, if a sunspot happens and an astronaut's out on a spacewalk, that radiation will kill the astronaut. And so Jeff was very concerned because he'd had 8 of the best heliophysicists in the world work on that project for 10 years at a budget of $2 million a year. So 8 people, $20 million, 10 years. They were able to advance an algorithm that could warn astronauts an hour and a half in advance at a 50% accuracy. Now, the problem was if you're way out on an arm or somewhere way out on the space station, an hour and a half, you really couldn't get back to the space station and into this kind of sealed place, this shielded place. And so Jeff was really concerned about that because most of the time astronauts would react to say, I hear the alarms, but I got a job to do. And I'm going to flip the coin on 50-50. So Jeff decided to put a contest out there, and Kareem put it out. They put it out on an incentive, and a retired cell phone engineer came up with an idea in 3 weeks. And it just so happened that he had done a lot of radiation studies for cell phones, and he was able to create an algorithm for $35,000 in 3 weeks that advanced the prediction time to 24 hours in advance and 75% accuracy.
Wow.
So here you got 10 years, $20 million, 8 of the best heliophysicists in the world, and then one guy, 3 weeks, $35,000, and 40 times better result, or 25 times better result. And so you've got, and I think that's just the way it works, right? It's like I always said when I was at Radar, it's like when we look at, because we always have this impression in culture, who are the best thinkers? And we think, it's the designers, or it's the marketing people. But my question always was like, I think it's different than that. I think if you said in your neighborhood in Topeka, Kansas, who is the smartest person in the world about getting stains out of cotton? I'll bet it's some grandma that is the biggest innovator there ever was, right? It's like, I mix baking soda and this, and it does an amazing job. Well, how do we capture that cognitive surplus, right? Like those people that don't even know that people want to know the answer to things, and companies really want to know that. And how do you set a system up? So this whole movement towards open talent really started there. How do companies buy results from people that have that kind of passion for a problem? And certainly the lab started with the NASA stuff. What's happened because of the start of Upwork and Fiverr and Freelancer gave people to work in an asynchronous way. It's like, and I think still today you see that. Steve King's really great research shows that what we think of freelancers as this binary, I'm a freelancer, I full-time work. The reality is 75% of freelancers are side giggers, right? 25% take freelancing full-time. 75% say, I'm bored. I'm bored with my work. I want to do something really fun and different, right? So I had this company that I started called Victors and Spoils. And the idea was to compete with big agencies because I had worked with a few. But we would, instead of having, our competitors had 20,000 people on their team. We had 20 people, but 10,000 people around the world that will work for us. And so what we found over and over again was it were people that were totally disrespected by the culture of advertising. One guy who we paid $150,000 to, and he came up with the brand anthem for Harley Davidson, was a guy by the name of Whit Hiller in Lexington, Kentucky, who had tried for 5 years to get a job in a New York and LA ad agency, had never, ever had an email returned because he's a Vespa dealership manager from Lexington. Nobody paid attention to him. But oh my God, he was like pure magic. And by having an open platform that allowed him to do the work he wanted to do, and allowed a brand like Harley Davidson to take advantage of that, it was just this massive opportunity. And so what we've seen is it's getting a lot more organized. And now it's not just outcomes, but it's also, man, how do I hire a really great AI strategist today? There's no way for you and I as a small company to hire a good one because they're all sucked up by the tech companies and everything else, right? And so, I mean, one of the examples I use in my upcoming book is like, imagine Susan becomes the CEO of a Fortune 500 company, and you feel like one of the mandates is you have to create a AI strategy, right? Like, what am I going to do in the world of AI?
I'm
Now,
sure
there's two
all of
ways.
my listeners are feeling that exact same pressure.
Exactly, right?
Right now.
Exactly.
What should they do, John?
Exactly. Well, I mean, I think there's two alternatives, right? I mean, the traditional way to do it is Susan would go to her CHRO and she would say, I need to hire a SVP of AI. And you would take 6 to 8 months to do that. And you would find somebody probably pretty good because you're a Fortune 500 company, you can pay a big fee. But 6 to 8 months is a long time. And then when you hired her, she would take 6 months to hire her team because it's really hard to hire that talent. And then 3 months to once the team's together, 3 months to figure out the strategy. Well, that's what, 15 months. I mean, in the world of AI, it's like, it's decades.
Right. It's 100 new applications being launched every 60 days in AI.
Exactly. And so the alternative is going to a platform like Business Talent Group or Catalent and saying, I want to identify the top 10 people in the world that have expertise in my field that are AI specialists. I want to bring them to Boston for 2 days. I want to have a design workshop. I'm going to come up with what are the 100 tasks that we would need to do to create the right AI strategy. And with that list, who of those 10 people could do some of those tasks? And who else do we need to get to do the other tasks? You can assign that in 2 or 3 days, have them work on it. And 3 or 4 weeks later, you have a fully baked strategy with 20 or 30 specialists that have worked with you as a team on creating this strategy, people that you've already kind of identified that might be really good to be on your internal team. So it's a recruiting process, it's a strategy process. And in a month versus 15 months, you've got the ability to kind of be up and running and testing things, right? And like, okay, we're going to focus here. This is where our strategy is going to be. We're not going to do that. All those things. And I think that's the way the world works. The world is working, or the world is moving way too fast to have fixed cost labor today. And I think the thing that even accelerates that in my mind lately is just imagine in AI in another context. I maybe you know this, but I would be really fascinated to know how many companies had an AI budget before November of 2022. Not many, right? So, nope. Right. So you have to have a very strong balance sheet in order to dedicate like, oh my God, AI is going to disrupt us and it's an existential threat. We have to focus on that. But where are you going to get the money, right? You got all these fixed costs. You've got to deliver product. You've got to, capital investment into equipment. And so the biggest fixed cost for 90% of the world's companies is labor. Why not have a variable cost labor pool that says, wow, it was great that these teams were working on this, but in the context of AI, that's not really that important anymore. We should turn that off and we should turn on this new, we need to make an investment in this new area. And so I think that in the future, that all fixed costs will become more variable, including labor, because companies will need a stronger balance sheet in order to make the investments they didn't even know they needed 3 or 4 months beforehand. And that flexibility is going to be super important to be successful.
Well, where does it stand with worker protection and actually
that's a great question. I mean, I think we in the US are woefully behind, right? I think if you look at the EU and other places in the world, socialized medicine or government supported medicine and retirement and things like that, it's much easier for people to create a portfolio of jobs. The way that I've looked at it is, maybe I'm off or maybe I'm too optimistic, but the way that I think about freelance and open talent is it's really the rise of a new kind of micro entrepreneur class, right? I mean, you're a micro entrepreneur, I'm a micro entrepreneur. We could be called freelancers, right? And what's really shifted is that digital tools have become so cheap that you can run a company that before it would take hundreds of people to run. I mean, just imagine how much this would cost, like this podcast would cost in an analog world with actual videotape. All those things are audio tape, right? It would be exorbitant.
And the producers to do it and the talent to do it.
Exactly. My favorite story that I love so much is a friend of mine is a climbing partner for a long time is Jimmy Chin, and Jimmy Chin won the Oscar for Free Solo, which is a movie a couple years ago. And I love his journey because I think it tells the story of how technology really has changed what a micro entrepreneur or freelancer can be. And that is that Jimmy back in the day was a dirtbag climber. He lived in his car in Yosemite. He climbed every day. He was sponsored by North Face. So when he wanted to get money, he needed to go on an expedition. And in order to make that expedition work, he needed to get publicity. And so he would go to Outside Magazine and he would say, hey, he would beg the editor saying, hey, I'm going to go on this expedition. Will you please send a writer and photographer with me to document it? And if he was lucky, 1 out of 5, he would get sponsored. He would get Outside to pay attention enough to do this expedition. So he'd go on the expedition. It would take a month or so. And it would take 6 months for the editors and the photographers to edit the documents. It would take a couple months for it to be printed and distributed. Hundreds of people would be involved bringing Jimmy's story out to the world. North Face would run an ad in the magazine and they would pay Jimmy extra money for this article, right? Because of the publicity. And that's the way it used to work. And the biggest that Outside ever got was 850,000 people. And in fact, on Instagram, that's the size of their community, 850,000 people. Well, this thing called Instagram came about and Jimmy just started posting and he was really savvy. He and I were on the board of a company that helped him accelerate his growth. And he went from 25,000 followers to 3.7 million followers. And that's what 3.5 times bigger than Outside's. And so now Jimmy is in a place where it's all direct to Jimmy. And so we were skiing in Alaska a couple of years ago, and this place that we went, usually they figure you ski 2 days because the weather's so bad. So they kind of say the fuel costs and everything was based on 2 days. Well, it just so happened that this trip, it was 7 days of sun and we were skiing every day. So the owner came to us and said, I know this is a sponsored trip. It's really great, but I can't afford to keep flying you guys in these helicopters. So Jimmy's over in the corner playing with his phone, right? He's sitting there doing whatever on his phone. And the owner of the helicopter operation is talking to the guys running the trip. And Jimmy interrupts and is like, hey, I just posted 2 Instagram photos. I charge $50,000 per photo. We have $100,000 available for fuel. So I think we're good for the week. And Jimmy does that now, right? If Range Rover wants to run an ad, Jimmy says, hey, bring Range Rovers to Jackson where I live. I'll drive around with my friends and do some climbing. I'll take some photos, but it's $50,000 per photo. So here's the dilemma for a company. Range Rover can pay $50,000. Jimmy can take pictures that day and it can be on Instagram up the next day to 3.7 million people. Or they can run an ad in Outside Magazine that takes months to produce and pay 250,000 people. And it takes hundreds of people to do it. So marketers are smart. They're like, I'm going to put my money with Jimmy. It's a fraction of the cost, a fifth of the money. I get 5 times the audience and it's done immediately. And so I think
the credibility is something, because there's once again, no intermediary.
Exactly. And so I think you see those dynamics. I think the other dynamics you're seeing are our good friend Balaji Bondili. I write about him a lot in the book because he's done so much great open talent stuff at Deloitte. But he's been really honest. His point is like, look, Deloitte and all the big consulting companies charge 5 times employees' salaries. And that's the cost of the brand and the cost of the marketing and the cost of the executives.
I was a marketing consultant, I can confirm.
There you go, right? Exactly. And so, but what's transpired is that now, because you've got great platforms, again, like Business Talent Group or Catalent or a lot of those folks who've retired from places like Deloitte are now sitting out there, and you can hire them for maybe 1.5 times what they used to get paid. So they're getting 50% more than what they used to get paid from Deloitte. But the company's saving 3.5 times because they're not paying the 5 times amount for the exact same person and the exact same work. And I think that's what we're seeing, right? It's like this, essentially, the way I've looked at it is, historically, a brand like Deloitte, it was nothing more than a matching agent, right? It's like, or McKinsey is a great example, right? I need to value my company. I'm going to go to McKinsey because of their brand. I know that they'll match me with the very best talent, and I'm willing to pay 5 times their salary to do that. Well, now, like everything else in the world, right? Now you go to a Business Talent Group or a Graphite, and you can trust their ranking because there's comments from other people that have worked with Susan. There's like they have a 5-star rating. And to me, it's no different than an innovation of when Google first came out. Did you trust the phone book more or Google? Right? You were like, what? This digital thing can tell me where to go to take my laundry or to take my dry cleaning? I'm going to go to the old phone book, and who's got the biggest ad, and they must have the best service, right? Because they spent
Depends how my modem was responding that day.
Exactly.
15 minutes to turn it on, then I'd go to the phone book.
Well, right. But I think that's what happens with technology, right? Technology is driven this kind of disintermediating factor. And if you want a great digital strategist, you can pay 5 times by going to Deloitte, or you can pay a fifth of that by going, or a third of that by going to a Business Talent Group.
So, John, what is the advice that you would give to my innovation leader friends who are listening about how they can begin to think about the talent that they're deploying? And it's worth reminding people that the shortest lived spot in the C-suite is the Chief Innovation Officer, who I've also learned is now being referred to as the CINO, C-I-N-O, Chief Innovation Officer, as opposed to the CIO, not to be confused with the Chief Information Officer. But
right.
Give us some pearls of wisdom. What's the advice, John, that you would give to folks who have an innovation mandate in their companies? Where do they start when they start thinking about open talent?
Well, these are just lessons I've learned from the hard way, right? Like, I think that you've got to go slow to go fast. And all these kinds of big innovations, you've probably seen it more than I have, really have more to do with organizational change and personal behavior change than anything else, right? And when you create big disruptions like open talent, there's a talent industrial complex that's going to like get the hackles up and try to protect the bureaucracy, right? It's just the way it works, and it's the way everything works. Like, it's why GM and Ford and Chrysler couldn't start the electric car revolution. It had to be somebody that was outside and disruptive and get big enough that it was like, holy shit, the culture is going to change. We better do it. So they don't have that ability to change, because the reality is you don't become conservative until you have something to conserve. And for GM and Ford, and especially for GM and Ford, their truck business that ran on gas was something they needed to protect, until the point that the mindset shifted, say, oh shit, this electric car thing might be bigger than that. and we need to shift. So I think there's a bunch of things. First is you've got to focus on an abundant mindset, right? That's the kind of, to me, the first step. How do you shift that mindset so that it's about possibilities instead of a scarce mindset? You know, like, oh, we only have this much. Oh, it's got to be done in-house. Oh, we got 25 projects and we have a limited resource.
And the lawyers will come after us.
And the lawyers will come after us, whatever. And so I think that's the first thing. I think the second thing is break some rules. And I think the idea of like trying things on the side. And one of the things I find so fascinating in the open talent business that Hayden Brown talks about is really the biggest part of the open talent business and freelancing in the enterprise are people that use it as their secret sauce. And just imagine you as a mid-level marketing manager at Deloitte, and you just did some amazing research that could change the course of a product and probably your career, only to be told by Deloitte's deck writing group that it's 3 weeks out and your presentation's next week, 3 weeks out for them to work on it. So an alternative is you go to the internet and you look at PowerPoint decks and Upwork pops up and you get somebody in Serbia or in Ukraine that really need the work for $20 an hour and are amazing and turn around something overnight. And you're not going to tell anybody, right? You're just going to walk into the meeting, do a kick-ass job and say, oh, in my off hours, I've done this. And so what's transpired is people like you build teams like, oh, I could do that data science analysis myself, but I could hire somebody who's the best in the world at it for 3 hours and they could do an amazing job. And so now what we're seeing is the secret sauce of really productive employees creating their own freelance teams around them to empower themselves to work. And when you do that, what we've seen in our work is that a lot of innovative companies like Balaji at Deloitte say that he knows there's 50% more freelancing going on at Deloitte than people admit to, but they just won't tell him, right? And so it's happening at that secret sauce level where he says, hey, everybody, let's aggregate our freelance stuff. And people that are using it are like, no way, this is my accelerant for my career. If I give this back up to the bureaucracy, it's going to go back to 3 weeks to get my decks done, right? They're going to be all this kind of bureaucratic stuff. So sometimes it's breaking the rules, right? Sometimes as a chief innovation officer, you've got to just start using this stuff yourself. Like, how do you do that, right? Like, how do you, to me, it's just super simple examples. Like, I was on this Grand Canyon trip this week with a VC, and I was just asking about his business, and he said, oh my God, I just found this company that does Indian virtual assistants, and I have this guy who is a software engineer who's my virtual assistant 40 hours a week for $1,200 a month, and he's the best virtual assistant I've ever had, the best assistant period I've ever had. So there's lots of ways for chief innovation officers and people to start understanding how this works. Like, it's one thing to talk about it philosophically and talk about the organizational change. It's another thing to get your hands dirty, right? To kind of go native, like we talked about in the anthropology thing, and start using these tools as your own secret sauce. Does it work? Does it not? Where does it work? How can I make it work in a really powerful way?
Yeah.
And then I think the other thing, it's a really big principle, is like being dedicated to working with the best people in the world, whether they're internal or external. If you've got hard problems to solve, like, why wouldn't you want the best people in the world? And break down those bureaucracies of like, well, I can't bring Susan in because it's going to take 2 months to do the MSA. And then we've got this bureaucracy and we've got this onboarding. It's like, how do you just use really innovative things? And one of the things that was a big breakthrough for Steve Rader at NASA is he just decided, I want people in NASA to use these tools, these open talent tools, these open innovation tools. And the big innovation for him was not changing culture or mandating anything. It was sneaking under the radar and telling everybody, just use your P card, just use your purchase card up to $5,000. And so everybody started using their purchase cards on buying labor out of NASA and using it for themselves, seeing the benefits, creating a cultural movement that all of a sudden now NASA has a budget of $185 million in open innovation because they've had enough people inside NASA use it effectively to say, I'm an advocate for this. This stuff really works. So that's using the tools that exist, but in a new way, right? Like, what's your P card? Like, how can you navigate the bureaucracy of your company to get around what you need to do and use it in a different way? So those are some of the things I would think about as a C-level person.
I love those ideas. And if you are, I strongly recommend, if you're interested in this conversation, to head to episode 3 of my podcast. Steve Radar was my 3rd guest when I was just launching the podcast. And he has some tales of how he's used open innovation at NASA and in other places that will blow your mind. Okay, so I'm now going to ask you the last 3 questions of the podcast, our hot seat questions.
Hot seat, I'm on it.
You're on the hot seat. So question 1, what is the most innovative invention in the history of mankind?
Oh my God.
Small questions.
Small questions. I still love the movable type press, the Gutenberg press.
Gutenberg. He's a big favorite on this show.
I know. I love it because there's an amazing story about Gutenberg. Do you know the story of the abbot of Sopheim?
Oh my, wait, I have to hold you to 3 questions. We might have time for an
sorry.
After that. Step 1. Okay. So
sorry. I always love to tell a story.
We love a good story here. If you had the choice to join any innovation team in history, because no innovation gets done by one person alone, which team would you want to be on?
Which team? Wow. I think I would love to go back and be in Bell Labs or someplace like that, right? Like the kind of the
favorite. Yeah.
Right. Like just go back where like the unlimited budget, you guys create the world, or Xerox Park, right? Or back in the early days. It's like, go just create some stuff. We don't know if it's going to work or not. Who cares? But we'll just go make some world changing stuff.
Right. Make a computer mouse for Steve Jobs.
Exactly.
And lastly, if you had the opportunity to create something that would make you incredibly happy, or at least eliminate a huge frustration in your life, what would the thing be?
The ability to turn off all my electronics and not be and disappear.
To overcome all your addictions? Is that what you're saying?
Exactly. That's it, right? It's so true. I mean, last week being down in the Grand Canyon with zero connectivity for 8 days, it was like, oh my God, this has been years since I've been in this place. It's unbelievable.
You mean in your own head, right? Just in your
with your friends in the moment. Yeah, and just like being able to be connected with people and not worrying about anything else in the world, just being present, right? That's just so hard to do these days.
Yes. Well, I can't thank you enough, John Winsor, for being a guest on my show.
It was such an honor.
How can people find you and your fantastic new book that's going to be coming out in 2024? How can people connect with you?
Just johnwinsor.com is probably the easiest way. And that'll take you to the book on Amazon and take you to my writing, and likewise my company, Open Assembly.
Fantastic. John Winsor, I highly recommend signing up for John's newsletter on Open Assembly. I wind up learning so much about the future of work. Thank you so much for joining me today, John.
Thanks, Susan. I really enjoyed it.